Opening the center immediately claims central space and prepares active piece development. Establishing a central pawn presence mirrors white's intent, immediately contesting the core of the board. Sharpening the central struggle, this gambit immediately offers pawn play for rapid development and influence. Black immediately relinquishes central pawn presence, opting for piece activity and the potential to pressure white's structure rather than immediate equality. Developing knights early often secures central influence and prepares for castling. Preparing to expand on the queen side, this move grants flexibility for future piece development and potential pawn breaks. Solidifying the pawn center, white prepares to develop the bishop to a more active diagonal. Developing the bishop actively, this piece now eyes the central d4 pawn, creating immediate positional pressure and forcing white to consider defensive maneuvers rather than pure development. Regaining the pawn clears the bishop and eyes the d6 square, developing aggressively. Solidifying the queenside pawns while preparing to challenge the bishop's influence presents a nuanced positional choice. Now white's queen boldly eyes the queenside pawn structure, threatening a potential fork or forcing black into awkward defensive maneuvers. Sacrificing the bishop here creates an immediate pawn imbalance and opens lines, but it fundamentally weakens the dark squares around black's king. Unleashing the kingside pawn storm, you've opened a direct path for your king into the center, creating significant long-term weaknesses. Clearing the file for potential rook activity now introduces an early strategic target. Developing the bishop to a more active square, aiming to pressure black's center and prepare for castling. Developing the knight to f6 initiates a subtle repositioning, reinforcing central control and preparing for castling, a solidifying step in the ensuing middle game struggle. Developing the knight here aims to contest central influence and prepare for kingside castling, a sensible follow-up to the pawn structure's evolution. Developing the knight to d7 supports the central pawn structure and prepares for further piece activity, subtly challenging white's queenside pressure. Solidifying the center and preparing to castle, this quiet maneuver aims to improve king's safety while keeping options open. Provoking an immediate pawn structure shakeup, this gambit boldly contests the center and seeks active piece play. Liberating the d-pawn initiates a pawn storm and potentially opens a diagonal for the queen, creating significant attacking chances. Opening the e-file for its rook, black solidifies the pawn chain, aiming to counter white's central space advantage. Proactively addressing the queenside, this aims to restrict black's expansion while preparing for a potential queenside pawn storm. Developing the bishop to d6 strategically bolsters the pawn chain's defense while preparing for a potential queenside advance. Securing the monarch opens up a central pawn push, aiming to dismantle black's cramped position. Averting immediate threats while preparing to challenge white's central pawn grip. Shifting the king frees the g-file for rook activity, preparing a central pawn push. This pawn thrust dramatically seizes space, but exposes your monarch to future kingside pressure. Initiating an aggressive pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to exploit the exposed monarch and create attacking chances. Sacrificing material for initiative, this opens the g-file and creates king safety issues. Unlocking the h1a8 diagonal opens a direct assault channel, potentially pressuring black's compromised kingside pawn structure. Finally, the knight finds a secure outpost, challenging white's central pawn advances and preparing a counterstrike. Positioning the bishop here aims to free the queen and support potential advances on the kingside, though it momentarily neglects central pawn tension. Securing the king with this castling maneuver creates a safe haven amidst the pawn storm. Unleashing an f-pawn storm aims to crack open the kingside, but it also dangerously weakens the white king's sanctuary. Re-establishing piece activity, ng6 seeks to contest the central files and offers prophylaxis against white's kingside pawn storm. Asserting control of the central dark squares, this move aims to solidify white's pawn chain and prepare for future queenside expansion, though it does commit the bishop to a more exposed diagonal. a deliberate repositioning to activate the rook, aiming for control of the open file and potential harassment of white's queenside pawns. Shifting the queen away allows kingside pawn play, targeting the e4 pawn and potentially opening lines. A bold attempt to establish central influence, though it relinquishes pressure on the kingside, leaving the dark-squared bishop potentially vulnerable. Opening the queenside to create new avenues of attack against black's somewhat passive structure. Exploring the open e-file opens up possibilities, but also requires careful safeguarding of the king. Preparing to wrestle control of the open f-file, this rook maneuver signals an aggressive intent to challenge black's central space. A bold repositioning, bringing the rook to the open file to contest control and potentially support central advances. Shifting the queen to open a line for rook development, aiming to challenge the central d-file's dominance and create dynamic possibilities. Sacrificing the bishop opens lines for your queen and rook, creating immediate counterplay against white's potentially exposed king. Exposing the king opens a volatile storm on the kingside, a daring gambit for initiative. Capturing the pawn opens crucial diagonals, potentially liberating your pieces and creating threats against white's somewhat exposed monarch. Centralizing the knight to attack the pinned bishop creates immediate tactical pressure and opens lines. Unleashing the rook dramatically shifts the pawn structure and opens crucial diagonals. Dislodging the rook from the vital d-file sets up a central pawn advance. Introducing a rook to the open central file offers crucial counterplay and eyes on white's potentially weakened kingside pawn structure. The queen now retreats, anticipating a potential breakthrough on the kingside pawn chain. Challenging the central control and aiming to activate the queen for counterplay. Focus shifts to a potential kingside attack as the rooks align, creating imposing central pressure. A bold foray into enemy territory, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and gain crucial space on the d-file. Consolidating the bishop's influence along this diagonal offers a new attacking avenue towards black's king. The rook shifts, seeking to engage on the open file and create counterplay against white's kingside pawn structure. Fortifying the queen's central influence, this move aims to redeploy the rook to a more active square. A daring foray, pushing the knight into white's territory, seeking counterplay through disruption. Seizing the open file decisively, this exchange aims to simplify into a favorable endgame by eliminating black's active rook. Recapturing the pawn unlocks a potential queen invasion, creating immediate threats and forcing white's pieces to scramble defensively. Securing the d-file, the rook mobilizes, anticipating a potential queenside advance or central consolidation. Seizing the open file, this rook boldly invades, challenging white's central control and seeking out weaknesses. King's safety temporarily improves, but the d4 pawn becomes a lingering weakness for white. Reclaiming the d-file with the queen sets up potential central pressure and reinforces the pieces defending the king. Unlocking the long-lost queen's rook file opens a direct assault on the exposed monarch, creating immediate danger. Sharpening the attack on the g-file, aiming to exploit white's doubled pawns and potentially open lines. Securing the kingside is now paramount, preventing a decisive black invasion. Stabilizing the queen offers respite, yet the cramped knight on h4 remains a potential target. Unleashing a decisive tactic, white clears the path for queen dominance and a material advantage. Clearing the third rank opens a desperate race against time for black's king. Unleashing the queen here opens a floodgate of tactical possibilities, potentially overwhelming black's exposed monarch.